Awesome. Hey, everybody. Really excited to be here and excited to talk a little bit about Bitcoin semantics and things related to rollups. My name's Giannis, and yeah, let's dive straight into it. The first thing I do want to cover before I dive into the semantic session that we're about to have is that privacy is completely normal. I don't think privacy devs should be thrown in jail for developing really strong privacy tools. And I think if people think this situation is isolated to things like Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet, I think people are mistaken. And I think we need to advocate and support the people that are building privacy tools in public, independent if they're on top of Bitcoin. So I would really implore everyone who's watching today to go out and support privacy developers. And yeah, before we get into like the semantics of this entire thing, I want to kind of share some resources that are going to be a lot better technical resources than probably what my talk's probably going to dive into. So check out Celestia to learn more about sovereign rollups. Check out ethereum.org to learn more about smart contract rollups, and bitcoinrollups.org and bitcoinrollups.io to learn more about how these implementations could be built on top of Bitcoin. So rollups. What are rollups? What are these things that everyone's now developing on top of Bitcoin, and why are we using this word? Well, the traditional definition of a rollup is essentially a trustless sidechain. It's another blockchain that uses a parent blockchain for data availability and typically would have a trustless or trust minimized two-way peg validating bridge between it and the sidechain. So it's another execution environment. It would provide more throughput potentially than the layer one protocol. And that's why people built these things. They want to have trustless sidechains that inherit the security properties of the L1 itself and not have another consensus mechanism. But now we're using all these words, like, and when we talk about rollups, we're like throwing out like MEV and sequencers, and we're talking about provers and other types of L2s that are validiums and volitions, and everyone's like getting really, really confused. And it's like, oh man, like that's really complicated. Let's not call these things rollups or validiums or validia chains. Let's just call them L2s, because L2s is like this really easy thing that everyone understands, and we'll settle on that, right? But the problem is when we have these definitions and like talk about kind of protocols and not really dive into their various security properties, is you have someone like Alice here. Like she's great, right? Super stoked to have some Bitcoin. Alice owns some Bitcoin. She's loving life. And then she hears about this thing called a roll up, and she thinks because everything's an L2, that's an L2, and it has like this trustless validating bridge. And then she takes her Bitcoin and she puts it into the bridge, and then it spits out this like other version of Bitcoin that lives on this roll up or side chain. And she can do a lot of cool things now. She can do like Ethereum like transactions. So DeFi, she can, do things like buy NFT. She can use privacy applications like Railgun. She's loving it. It's great. But then everything goes bad. The bridge gets hacked. It wasn't as trust minimized or as trustless as people talked and said it was. And it wasn't as secure, and it didn't actually inherit the security of the layer one protocol. And that's kind of the situation that we're finding ourselves in today with all of these new layer twos coming to market, or things that claim to be layer twos. And when you look at Alice, she's really, really sad about this because she bought into the hype on Bitcoin Twitter and she lost all of her Bitcoin because the bridge was hacked. And these things exist, right? Bitcoin exists, Ethereum exists in alternative execution environments and application layers that can be built alongside Bitcoin and provide more utility to BTC, the asset exist. But kind of framing it as this trust minimized or trustless application layer, I think is not quite where we are. But like, again, semantics, right? Like what are actually rollups? What are rollups, right? Rollups are blockchains or sidechains that use a parent blockchain for data availability. So what that means is that the rollup blockchain stores a state root and at least enough transaction data to recompute the current state from Genesis based on the data that is stored in the parent blockchain. So in relationship to Bitcoin, what that means is that a rollup or a sidechain would take potentially something like a zero knowledge proof, and it would post that into Bitcoin as like a Bitcoin transaction. And then the rollup could eventually go, if it needed to, could go into Bitcoin and reconstruct the entire state of the blockchain based on the data that they could retrieve that data from Bitcoin full nodes. So when we talk about these things, rollups aren't necessarily L2s. And all of the current implementations of rollups on Bitcoin are not L2s. And this is where it gets really confusing because people kind of use these terms together, and this is where it gets really weird. Because remember, Alice is really upset and she's sad because she went into this roll up that was supposed to have like this really trustless bridge and like the ones in Ethereum do, and it didn't quite have that, and she lost all of her. A roll up is, remember, a roll up. It is an alternative blockchain. It is a side chain that uses a parent blockchain for data availability, thus inheriting the consensus. How we define L2. So projects where a user will lock funds into, let's say, a bridge contract or some type of multi-sig, and then they would be able to enter the L2, do a bunch of transactions there, and only use a Bitcoin L1 transaction to exit the L2 and not have to rely on any other consensus mechanism. So we're currently, right, tons of semantics, tons of definitions, and it's like, what the heck is going on? This is where we're at. Rollups are blockchains that post enough data to reconstruct their state based on the data that lives in Bitcoin. Bitcoin rollups are currently not L2s, and Alice is really upset because everyone told her it was an L2. And it's just like, what is actually going on here, right? This is insanity. And the issue is that we have these things of like comprehensive Bitcoin layer 2 solution lists, right? And everyone wants to be a part of this like new scaling ecosystem. And the problem is that we're putting things like rollups, even though they can exist today technically, we're grouping them into other groups of a generalized like framework for scaling solutions, and we're not really analyzing the trust properties and isolation of each other. So like, where is this coming from? Like, why are people talking about rollups? Back in 2022, a team called Rollkit from the Celestia ecosystem basically figured out how to inscribe a zero knowledge proof into Bitcoin, thus being able to use Bitcoin for data availability. So what this means is that it now can basically separate the Bitcoin blockchain and have an execution layer that kind of operates autonomously from Bitcoin, but it stores, its transaction data, pays fees to Bitcoin miners, and is able to verify the transactions based on some mechanism based on the data that's put in Bitcoin. So how this works in practice is that the sovereign rollup will execute a bunch of transactions. Let's say it's an EVM rollup and it has like NFTs and DeFi and smart contracts and whatever, executes a bunch of transactions. It posts that transaction data to Bitcoin. And then a group of rollup nodes will then read the data that's inside of Bitcoin, and they will verify that the execution of the rollup was done correctly. This is starkly different from how these things happen in Ethereum, as the Ethereum smart contract and the validators on Ethereum would be able to be the ones that would be able to verify this thing called a state transition, which is what the zero knowledge proof is. And now what's happening is this is not technically the best way to explain this, but we're basically replacing the role of the rollup light nodes with something like BitVM. So we're using an off-chain mechanism where Bitcoin full nodes can participate in a bridge program to verify the state transition and secure a two-way peg between the rollup and the Bitcoin blockchain. So we have the BitVM rollup, execute a bunch of transactions, send that to approver, who would then post that zero knowledge proof onto Bitcoin. And then the BitVM bridge program would be responsible for verifying if the execution of that state transition was done correctly. And if it needed to, can permit user withdrawals based on the state transition that's living in Bitcoin. So the reason like people are loving this stuff, because it's like, it's a new economic opportunity and people are really excited about the way that we can build on Bitcoin with these new execution layers, and the way that we're researching new ways to potentially add more trust minimize bridging protocols that people have been mentioning in previous talks. Super exciting time. So again, to finish the talk and finish the semantic session, Bitcoin rollups are blockchains that put a bunch of data on Bitcoin, and they may have a validating bridge, but that is not a requirement to be a rollup on top of Bitcoin. And they're not trustless yet, and they're not L2s yet. What would make it an L2 is a trustless validating bridge. Need a couple soft forks to do that. What would make it trust minimized is something like BitVM, and that's a super cool development that we might see in like the next, I would say, 12 to 18 months. And then we also have these other execution layers like Stacks, Meso, and other protocols like Bitcoin sidechains, who are blockchains that have an enshrined two-way peg with Bitcoin. They're not necessarily trustless, but they can really do a lot of interesting things to be more trust minimized, and they're still really cool. I think the way that we need to look at these things when we talk about L2s and talk about this like general framework of looking at Bitcoin scaling is being bullish, but also skeptical, and analyzing each of these implementations in isolation so users can clearly understand the risks associated with all of these different protocols. that's all I have for you guys today. I'm super bullish on Bitcoin rollups. I think they're really cool, and I'm also really interested in other Bitcoin application layers, and just think we're in a really interesting time right now. So yeah, that's my talk.